Have you ever watched a vice president in a $5,000 suit light his own career on fire? Just because he was too arrogant to read a 12-page handover contract, they thought I was a stubborn roadblock in their shiny corporate machine, tossing me aside to optimize their workflow. What they failed to realize was that I was the only deadbolt standing between their $500 million inventory and a sudden federal lockdown. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Reese Carter. I am 34 years old, and until about 20 minutes ago, I was the lead engineer of the cold chain integrity grid for Novartis Biologics, a sprawling biotech giant sitting comfortably in the freezing, wind-whipped heart of Chicago. You need to understand something fundamental about Novartis. We do not just make generic aspirin or over-the-counter cough syrup. We manufacture highly volatile, experimental gene therapies, stuff that costs more per ounce than flawless diamonds. And my job, my one absolute responsibility, was to ensure those therapies remained at exactly -80 degrees Fahrenheit from the moment they left our sterile labs to the second they reached a dying patient's veins. I designed the entire grid from the ground up. It was not just a collection of fancy industrial freezers. It was a living, breathing biometric fortress, governed by the strictest compliance laws dictated by the Food and Drug Administration. Enter Julian. Julian was our newly appointed vice president of supply chain. He looked like he had been grown in a corporate laboratory vat, specifically to star in an insufferable leadership training video. He wore custom Italian suits that probably cost more than my car, sported an aggressively bright white smile, and possessed absolutely zero background in biotechnology. He was a shiny new business graduate who truly believed supply chain management was identical whether you were moving cheap plastic toys or life-saving, highly unstable molecular compounds. It was a Tuesday morning when I received the calendar invite. The subject line simply read, "Sync and Align." There was no agenda attached, just a location conference room alpha. It was a literal fishbowl, floor-to-ceiling glass walls positioned in the dead center of the executive floor, designed specifically so everyone in the cubicles could see who was being thrown to the wolves. When I walked in, Julian was already standing at the head of the massive mahogany table, radiating arrogant energy. Sitting quietly in the far corner, looking intensely down at her digital tablet and actively avoiding eye contact with me, was Brenda from Human Resources. I knew exactly what was happening before I even pulled out a chair to sit down. Julian did not even offer me a seat. He leaned forward, planting both of his manicured hands firmly on the table, trying his absolute hardest to project an aura of unchallenged dominance. "Reese," he began, his voice dripping with that manufactured empathy they teach in weekend middle management seminars. "We are moving Novartis into a dynamic new era. We need agile workflows. We need to leverage our cross-functional synergies to create out-of-the-box solutions for our distribution networks. The market demands speed." I just stared at him, letting the hollow corporate buzzwords wash over me. "Julian, we move biological hazards and experimental drugs, not software updates. Agility in this field usually means cutting corners, and cutting corners means dead patients and massive federal lawsuits." His fake smile tightened instantly, his eyes growing cold and defensive. "And that right there is exactly the problem. Reese, you are a bottleneck. You are entirely too siloed. Your rigid, inflexible adherence to these outdated traceability protocols is strangling our new delivery model. We need a team player who understands fluid logistics, not a stubborn blockade who locks every single process behind a dozen unnecessary security checks. Effective immediately. We are terminating your employment. Your position is being eliminated to optimize our operational flow." I let his words hang in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the conference room. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not even flinch. In fact, I felt a deep sense of absolute calm wash over my body. I looked over at Brenda, who was practically trying to merge her physical form with the drywall, and then back to Julian. Julian, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and dead serious, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. You cannot just erase me from the system. The Food and Drug Administration mandates highly specific, hard-coded security protocols for the cold chain grid. I am the designated quality key holder. The entire system is biometrically tied to my personal data. If you remove my administrative access without the legally required handover process, the system will assume hostile intent. So, he loudly slammed his hand flat on the table, cutting me off. The sharp sound echoed loudly inside the glass room. Stop it right there. Reese, I am absolutely not interested in your cheap scare tactics. I have been in the corporate world long enough to know when a bitter, obsolete employee is trying to hold a department hostage with complex technical jargon. The Information Technology Department is already wiping your credentials from the mainframe as we speak. Hand over your security badge, right now. He extended an open palm toward me across the table, looking incredibly smug, like a victorious conqueror claiming his spoils. He truly thought he had won. He thought he had just streamlined a messy administrative process and asserted his alpha status on the corporate ladder. I looked down at his outstretched hand. I thought about the $480 million worth of experimental, highly fragile inventory sitting quietly in the sub-basement vaults. I thought about the massive titanium blast doors securing those vaults. I thought about the federal compliance tripwires I had painstakingly coded into the foundation of the building's digital architecture. Tripwires that were explicitly designed to trigger an immediate, irreversible total lockdown the second any unauthorized personnel attempted a hostile system takeover. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. I reached into my coat pocket, unclipped my plastic security badge, and placed it gently in the dead center of the mahogany table. Of course, Julian, I said softly, my voice laced with pure venom. Consider me optimized. I turned around and walked straight out of the glass room, leaving him standing there in his $5,000 suit. I did not argue. I did not look back. I just walked purposefully toward the elevator lobby, feeling the plush carpet under my boots, completely and utterly aware that the entire physical warehouse of Novartis Biologics was about to become a hostage of the United States government, and Julian had just happily lit the match himself. The biting wind cutting off Lake Michigan felt entirely different today. For 6 uninterrupted years, that sharp Chicago chill had been nothing more than an abrasive obstacle on my exhausted march from the parking garage to the sterile corporate lobby of Novartis Biologics. Today, however, it felt like a baptism. I pulled the collar of my wool coat up against the freezing gusts and took a deep, unrestrained breath. My chest, which had been locked in a state of permanent, low-grade anxiety for over half a decade, finally expanded all the way. I walked away from the towering glass and steel monument to corporate greed and headed straight toward a small, dimly lit artisan coffee shop located 3 blocks down the avenue. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful greeting as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the rich, intoxicating aroma of freshly roasted espresso beans and warm cinnamon. I ordered a large dark roast, paid in cash, and settled into a worn leather armchair, tucked perfectly into the corner. I wrapped both of my freezing hands around the ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into my skin. For the first time in over 2,000 days, my phone was completely silent. No emergency alerts about temperature fluctuations, no frantic emails from compliance officers, no demanding text messages from oblivious vice presidents, just the soft murmur of jazz music from the ceiling speakers and the soothing, rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine. I took a slow sip of the bitter, piping hot coffee, closed my eyes, and smiled. I was utterly free. Meanwhile, exactly 1/4 mile away, inside the aggressively sanitized server room of Novartis headquarters, the air was crackling with a very different kind of energy. Julian was pacing back and forth behind the desk of a highly stressed, sleep-deprived information technology technician. Julian had not even bothered to take the elevator to his corner office to celebrate his perceived victory. He had marched straight down to the basement, absolutely determined to scorch the earth behind me. He wanted my digital footprint wiped clean before I even reached the sidewalk. "I want her gone," Julian commanded, his voice echoing sharply against the banks of humming servers. "Revoke all administrative privileges, delete her biometric profiles, wipe her out of the global directory. I want zero trace of that woman left on this network by the time I finish this sentence." The young technician, whose name tag read David, hesitated. His hands hovered nervously over the mechanical keyboard. He stared at the primary dashboard of the cold chain integrity grid, noticing the massive, glaring security warnings flanking my user profile. "Sir," David stammered, his voice trembling slightly, "I can certainly disable her email and local network access, but the sub-basement environmental controls are completely segregated. The grid requires a secondary, authorized signature to transfer the quality keyholder designation. If I force a hard delete on her profile without running the mandatory 60-day handover protocol, the system architecture might misinterpret the command." Julian leaned over the desk, invading David's personal space, his expensive cologne masking the smell of the room's ozone. "Do I look like I care about an archaic digital transition protocol? She is terminated. She is a civilian. Leaving her with root access to our critical infrastructure for even one more second is a massive liability. Do your job, force the delete, and override whatever warning prompt tells you otherwise. Do it now." Intimidated and fearing for his own livelihood, David swallowed hard, nodded weakly, and typed the administrative override command. He hit the enter key. Deep within the digital nervous system of the Novaris server architecture, a silent, invisible shockwave rippled through the mainframe. The cold chain integrity grid was not a simple database. It was a highly sophisticated, semi-autonomous defensive program, built specifically to satisfy the paranoid, ultra-strict regulatory requirements of federal health agencies. When David hit the enter key, the system registered the sudden, unverified deletion of the primary biometric anchor. It immediately scanned the network for the legally required transition files. It searched for a replacement retina scan. It searched for the dual-factor executive sign-off. It found absolutely nothing. The system logic gate closed. The binary conclusion was instantaneous and terrifyingly simple. The quality keyholder had not been transferred. The quality keyholder had been violently removed. Ergo, the mainframe was currently under an active, hostile cyber attack. The digital vaults had been breached. The core directive of the grid overrode every single localized corporate command: protect the biological assets at all costs. 3 floors below ground, in the cavernous, hyper-sterile sub-basement, where $480 million worth of experimental gene therapies were kept in a state of suspended animation, the physical world violently caught up with the digital realm. A deafening, low-frequency warning siren suddenly erupted from the ceiling arrays, drowning out the gentle hum of the refrigeration units. The bright white fluorescent tubes running along the ceiling violently snapped off, instantly replaced by the sinister, pulsing glow of emergency red strobe lights. Down in the server room, David watched in absolute horror as his monitor flashed crimson. Every single administrative credential he possessed was instantly revoked. "What did you do?" Julian snapped, taking a step back as the alarms began blaring even through the thick walls of the IT department. "It is not me," David yelled over the noise, frantically slamming his fingers against the keyboard, only to be met with a cascade of access-denied prompts. "The grid locked me out. It locked everyone out." Down in the vault sector, massive pneumatic pumps engaged with a terrifying mechanical roar. 4-inch thick solid titanium blast doors, designed to withstand a direct explosive impact, dropped from the ceiling tracks with bone-rattling force. They slammed into the reinforced concrete floor, throwing heavy steel deadbolts into place with a series of loud, heavy metallic thuds. In a matter of seconds, the entire inventory was hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world. Back on David's monitor, the chaotic scrolling text suddenly froze. A single, massive black box appeared in the center of the screen, displaying a stark, terrifying message in a glowing red font. Critical security event. Hostile intrusion detected. Biometric anchor severed. Initiating quarantine protocol. Beneath the text, a massive digital timer appeared, beginning its relentless, synchronized march backward from exactly 4 hours. David pointed a shaking finger at the screen. "Sir, the system triggered the failsafe. It thinks we are stealing the inventory. It just sealed the blast doors to the main cryovaults." Julian scoffed, trying to maintain his authoritative posture despite the blaring sirens. "Then tell the maintenance crew to go down there and manually open the doors, and plug the alarms while you are at it." David looked up at the vice president, his face completely drained of color. "You do not understand. Those doors do not have manual releases. They are magnetically sealed by the grid, and that timer on the screen is not a countdown to a reboot. If the original primary key holder does not physically scan her retina at the main terminal in exactly 3 hours and 59 minutes, the grid will automatically transmit an encrypted red alert signal directly to the regional office of the Food and Drug Administration. It will automatically log a massive biosecurity breach." Julian's arrogant sneer finally faltered, melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated dread. While Julian stood paralyzed in the flashing red light of his own disastrous hubris, I signaled the barista for a second cup of coffee. I added a little extra cream, took a slow sip, and watched the busy Chicago traffic roll by outside the window, enjoying the most peaceful Tuesday morning I had experienced in a very, very long time. Julian paced the corridor outside the sub-basement vaults like a caged animal. The emergency red strobe lights painted his sweat-slicked face in harsh crimson intervals, casting long, menacing shadows against the concrete walls. He absolutely refused to accept defeat. To a man whose entire corporate identity was built on aggressive posturing, bullying subordinates, and manipulating quarterly spreadsheets, a blinking digital timer was nothing more than an insubordinate computer program. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, completely bypassed the information technology department, and dialed the head of building maintenance directly. "Bring your heavy cutting equipment down to Sector 4 immediately," Julian barked into the receiver, his voice echoing loudly in the empty, alarm-filled hallway. "I do not care what you are currently working on. We have a stupid software glitch holding the main blast door shut. Bring the industrial diamond drills and rip the electronic locking housing right off the wall. We are opening this vault right now." 15 minutes later, a team of highly confused, visibly nervous maintenance workers stood before the massive titanium slabs. The lead engineer, a burly man named Mike wearing heavy denim overalls, stared at the airtight magnetic seal and shook his head in sheer disbelief. He tried desperately to explain to Julian that these were not standard electronic deadbolts. They were military-grade containment barriers integrated directly into the structural foundation of the building. Julian simply stepped forward, his face red with rage, and screamed at the crew to start drilling immediately or consider themselves permanently unemployed. With a heavy, reluctant sigh, Mike powered up a massive, diamond-tipped industrial rotary drill. He braced his boots against the floor and pressed the spinning bit aggressively against the reinforced steel casing that housed the main biometric terminal. The deafening, high-pitched shriek of metal violently grinding against metal instantly overpowered the sound of the blaring warning sirens. A bright shower of orange sparks rained down onto the polished floor. Julian crossed his arms over his chest, smirking in the flashing red light. He was thoroughly convinced that brute force and intimidation were about to solve his problem, just as they always had in his career. He was tragically, catastrophically wrong. Deep inside the thick walls of the vault, highly sensitive seismic transducers instantly registered the violent, high-frequency vibrations of the drill bit. The cold chain integrity grid rapidly absorbed this new stream of telemetry data. The artificial intelligence analyzed the frequency of the noise, the sustained physical pressure against the titanium, and the exact geometric location of the disturbance. The central logic processor recalculated the situational variables in a fraction of a millisecond. The event was no longer classified as a simple, unauthorized intrusion. The physical integrity of the vault was actively under physical assault. The mainframe immediately elevated the threat condition to a Priority 1 classification, targeted sabotage. The grid did exactly what it was strictly programmed to do when facing an imminent physical breach. It went into absolute preservation mode. Inside the massive vault, the industrial refrigeration units roared to life with a terrifying mechanical intensity. The system violently bypassed all standard daily operational limits. It plunged the ambient temperature of the containment zone down to absolute preservation levels, dropping rapidly toward negative 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Thick layers of white frost instantly crystallized across the massive steel pipes lining the ceiling. The goal of the grid was simple and ruthless: flash freeze the highly volatile gene therapies, rendering them chemically inert and completely useless to anyone trying to steal them. Upstairs, in a luxurious, glass-walled corner office on the top floor, the chief executive officer of Novartis Biologics was furiously pounding his fists on his mahogany desk. The blaring building-wide alarms had abruptly interrupted his morning golf preparations. Highly annoyed but completely confident in his supreme authority, he logged into his platinum laptop, pulled up the master administrative console, and fully intended to use his ultimate executive override code to shut down whatever pathetic glitch was causing this massive commotion. He typed his highly complex master password. He pressed the enter key with authority. A harsh, bright yellow banner violently flashed across his screen. Executive override denied. System in sabotage, lockdown, all supervisory commands suspended. The chief executive officer stared at the glowing monitor in absolute, paralyzed disbelief. He tried again. Access denied. He tried a third time, his hands shaking with sudden, cold panic. The system completely locked his account out of the network. The grid recognized absolutely no authority other than the missing biometric signature of the primary quality key holder. Fancy job titles and golden parachutes meant absolutely nothing to a cold, calculating machine actively protecting nearly $500 million in biological assets. But the nightmare was only just beginning to unfold. When the internal threat level hit targeted sabotage, the grid automatically woke up a swarm of dormant, highly aggressive internal audit bots. These were purely analytical software agents designed by me to ensure strict regulatory compliance during a catastrophic event. The bots immediately scanned the network and identified a massive, highly suspicious discrepancy. A violent physical breach attempt was happening in the sub-basement, while the entire executive leadership team was present and active in the building. The bots drew the only logical conclusion programmed into their federal risk assessment matrix. They suspected an inside job. They suspected massive corporate espionage orchestrated by the leadership team themselves. Instantly, the bots triggered a Level 5 compliance audit. This was the absolute nuclear option of corporate governance. The system immediately reached out to the primary financial servers and executed a total, uncompromising freeze on all internal company stock trading. Every single share of Novartis Biologics owned by an employee, from the overnight janitor to the chief executive officer, was locked down completely tight. No one could buy, no one could sell. The system was ruthlessly preventing a potential insider trading dump before the federal authorities arrived to investigate the crime scene. Simultaneously, the bots drafted a terrifying, highly detailed emergency alert and blasted it directly to the personal smartphones of every single member of the board of directors. Across the country, wealthy investors sitting on lush golf courses, relaxing in luxury yachts, and eating in private dining rooms suddenly felt their phones buzzing frantically with messages warning them of an active, catastrophic biosecurity breach at their flagship facility. Total, unfiltered, glorious chaos descended upon the corporate headquarters. Back on the executive floor, the legal department was having a spectacular collective nervous breakdown. A dozen highly paid corporate attorneys were running frantically around their wood-paneled suites, screaming at each other at the top of their lungs. Their expensive silk ties were loosened, their hair was messy, and their faces were pale with absolute terror. They knew the federal regulations better than anyone else in the building. They knew with absolute certainty that if the Food and Drug Administration received that automated red alert, heavily armed federal agents would swarm the building within hours. Novaris would face hundreds of millions of dollars in federal fines, criminal negligence charges, and the potential permanent revocation of their lucrative manufacturing licenses. Desperation quickly bred extreme stupidity. The General Counsel, a man who proudly charged $2,000 an hour for his supposed strategic brilliance, drafted a frantic, incredibly aggressive email and sent it directly to my personal address. Sitting comfortably in the cozy artisan coffee shop, I felt my phone buzz gently in my wool coat pocket. I pulled it out, unlocked the screen, and opened my inbox. The subject line was written in aggressive, bold capital letters, screaming with unhinged panic, urgent legal demand, cease and desist order. I took a slow, deliberate, highly satisfying sip of my dark roast coffee and read the message. The General Counsel was threatening me with a massive, multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit. He accused me of malicious economic espionage, intentional corporate sabotage, and grand larceny. The email aggressively demanded that I immediately reply with the master decryption key to unlock the vault doors. It stated very clearly that if I did not provide the override codes within the next 15 minutes, they would contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation and have me arrested for holding corporate property hostage. It was a truly spectacular display of blind panic masquerading as legal authority. They were trying to bully a ghost. They were trying to intimidate the only person on the planet who actually understood how the trap they had just willingly sprung on themselves truly worked. I leaned back in the worn leather armchair, watching a young couple walk their golden retriever past the frosted window of the cafe. The jazz music swelled pleasantly in the background. I could almost hear the beautiful sound of Julian screaming in the sub-basement. The sheer, unadulterated joy of watching these arrogant corporate titans completely dismantle their own empire piece by piece was intoxicating. They had fired me for being too siloed, for caring entirely too much about the strict rules, and now, those exact same rules were violently crushing them under the immense, unstoppable weight of their own staggering ignorance. I had finished my dark roast coffee, tipped the barista generously, and taken a slow, highly enjoyable stroll back to my apartment. By the time I unlocked my front door and stepped into my quiet, sunlit home office, the frantic energy of the corporate meltdown happening downtown felt like it belonged to a completely different universe. I walked over to my antique mahogany bar cart, poured myself a generous measure of 20-year-old Kentucky bourbon into a heavy crystal glass, and sat down at my custom-built desk. I woke up my personal laptop and pulled up the hysterical, threat-laden email from the General Counsel. I took a smooth sip of the bourbon, feeling the warm, amber liquid coat my throat. I did not feel an ounce of intimidation. In fact, I felt a profound sense of absolute, untouchable power. They had tried to bring a knife to a gunfight, completely unaware that I was the one who had designed the entire battlefield. I opened my personal digital archives and located the meticulously organized folder containing my original employment documentation. I extracted the highly detailed, 60-page master contract I had negotiated and signed 6 years ago. It was a masterpiece of proactive legal engineering. Using my PDF editor, I carefully highlighted a very specific, heavily lawyered paragraph on page 42. I then hit reply all on the General Counsel's email, making absolutely certain to copy every single member of the board of directors, the chief executive officer, and just for good measure, Julian. I began to type, my fingers gliding across the mechanical keyboard with the rhythmic precision of a concert pianist. My tone was not angry, it was lethally polite, impeccably professional, and completely devoid of any emotional vulnerability. To the Office of the General Counsel and the Board of Directors, I wrote, I am in receipt of your correspondence demanding the master decryption codes for the cold chain integrity grid. I highly advise you to retract your threats of criminal litigation immediately, as they are completely baseless and demonstrate a catastrophic misunderstanding of your own corporate compliance infrastructure. I took another sip of bourbon, savoring the smoky finish, and continued. Please refer to the attached document, specifically Clause 8.4 of my employment agreement, which I have highlighted for your convenience. As clearly stated in this legally binding document, any termination of my role as the primary quality keyholder that does not include a mandatory 60-day joint handover period automatically activates the integrity defense system. By having my administrative access abruptly deleted this morning without the required transitional protocols, your executive team officially classified my departure as a hostile network event. Consequently, I am no longer an employee. I am a private civilian with absolutely zero contractual or fiduciary obligations to Novartis Biologics. I leaned back in my leather chair, visualizing the veins popping out on the general counsel's forehead as he read the next paragraph. Furthermore, your demand that I simply hand over the decryption key is physically and legally impossible. There is no password. There is no alphanumeric code that I can type into an email. The master key is a highly complex biometric hash directly tied to the unique vascular structure of my right retina. I cannot surrender my eyeball to your legal department. More importantly, as I am now a completely unaffiliated private citizen, any attempt by me to remotely access or alter the security protocols of a federally regulated biological containment facility would constitute a severe violation of federal cybersecurity laws. You are effectively ordering a civilian to commit a federal felony on your behalf. I respectfully decline. The bourbon was tasting exceptionally good today. I cracked my knuckles and moved on to the most critical part of the message, the ticking clock. I also feel it is my ethical duty to inform you of the thermodynamic reality currently unfolding in your sub-basement, because your maintenance team attempted to physically breach the vault doors with industrial drills. The grid has registered an active sabotage event. The system is currently purging the ambient heat to protect the inventory. The temperature inside the containment zone is dropping rapidly. If the ambient temperature continues to drop for another 3 hours, the molecular structure of the gene therapies will permanently crystallize. At that precise moment, your $480 million in experimental assets will instantly transform into worthless, dangerously unstable shards of frozen glass. The chemical bonds will shatter, and not a single insurance policy in the world will cover the loss, as the destruction was triggered by the direct documented orders of your own Vice President of Supply Chain. You do not have days to resolve this. You have minutes. I paused, letting the sheer, terrifying weight of that financial reality sink into the words. Now it was time for the final move. The checkmate. I opened a new tab, accessed my newly registered limited liability company portal, and downloaded a pristine, elegantly designed digital business card. While I cannot legally assist you as a former employee, I concluded, I am pleased to announce the launch of my new independent consulting firm, Carter Compliance Solutions. We specialize in emergency compliance rescue for high-stakes biometric deadlocks. Attached is my business card. Should you wish to retain my services as an independent federal contractor to resolve your current crisis, my firm is available for immediate hire. Please be advised that due to the extremely time-sensitive and highly specialized nature of this intervention, our emergency consultation rates apply. I attached the PDF of the contract. I attached the digital business card. I proofread the text one final time to ensure every single word was a perfectly sharpened blade. There was no hesitation. I moved my mouse over the send button and clicked it. I closed the laptop, picked up my crystal glass, and walked over to the large bay window of my home office. I looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline, watching the tiny cars move like ants along the busy streets below. I had built an impenetrable iron fortress, handed them the keys, and warned them about the trapdoors. They chose to ignore me. Now, they were locked inside a freezing cage of their own making, and I was the only person in the world holding the map to the exit. All they had to do now was decide exactly how much their pride was truly worth. Exactly 42 minutes after I clicked send on that legally engineered email, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of my mahogany desk. I glanced down. The caller identification displayed the highly restricted main routing number for the executive boardroom of Novartis Biologics. They were panicking. I let the phone ring 4 distinct times before I casually tapped the glass screen and engaged the speakerphone feature. I did not offer a greeting. I did not say a single word. I simply sat back in my leather chair, took a deep breath, and listened to the absolute, unfiltered chaos bleeding through the tiny audio speaker. "You absolute, unbelievable idiot." The voice belonged to the chief executive officer, and he was screaming with such raw fury that the boardroom microphone was heavily distorting his words. He was clearly not talking to me. He was actively berating Julian in front of the entire board of directors. "You arrogant, incompetent fool. You marched down to that server room to stroke your own fragile ego, and you managed to take our entire quarterly revenue hostage, $500 million. Julian frozen solid because you refused to read a standard transition document. Sir, I assure you, I was simply trying to execute the agile management framework we discussed last week." Julian stammered. His voice was completely stripped of every single ounce of that slick, condescending corporate bravado he had wielded so effortlessly in the glass conference room earlier that morning. He sounded remarkably small, terrified, and on the absolute verge of tears. "Shut your mouth right now before I have the building security team physically throw you through a plate glass window," the chief executive officer roared. There was a heavy, exhausted sigh transmitted over the line, followed by the loud sound of an expensive leather chair creaking under shifting weight. "Reese, are you currently on the line?" "I am here," I replied, keeping my tone completely flat, clinical, and completely devoid of any sympathetic emotion. "We need to fix this massive misunderstanding right now," he demanded, though the sharp, desperate edge in his voice completely undermined his attempt at an authoritative tone. "I have the general counsel sitting right next to me at the table. Tell her, David, tell her right now that she cannot legally do this to a publicly traded company." There was a long, incredibly painful silence on the other end of the line. When the general counsel finally spoke, he sounded exactly like a man who had just swallowed a handful of crushed glass. "Actually, sir, she can. I just finished a frantic consultation with our external federal compliance litigators. Her original employment contract is entirely bulletproof. She brilliantly anchored her primary employment status directly to Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations regarding biosecurity protocols. There are absolutely no legal loopholes for us to exploit. If we attempt to drag her into a civil lawsuit, we will be legally forced to admit in open federal court that we deliberately bypassed mandatory drug safety protocols. The government would strip our manufacturing licenses by tomorrow morning. We have absolutely zero legal leverage against her." The deafening silence that followed his admission was exquisite. I could practically hear the collective ego of a dozen wealthy executives violently deflating inside that luxurious room. The chief executive officer cleared his throat loudly, suddenly shifting his strategy into desperate damage control mode. "Okay, fine. Reese, listen to me very carefully. We all make regrettable mistakes in the heat of the moment. Julian acted prematurely and without my direct authorization. We are officially rescinding your termination notice. You are fully rehired, effective immediately. Come back to the building, unlock those vault doors, and we will gladly increase your base salary by 20%. We will even give you a corner office with a view of the lake. Just come down here and fix the system before we lose everything." I took a slow, methodical breath, staring intently at the amber bourbon resting in my crystal glass. "You seem to be operating under a fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of our current dynamic. I am not a disgruntled former employee looking for a hollow apology and a modest pay bump. I am now an independent contractor. I do not want your corner office, and I certainly do not want to be on your corporate payroll ever again. I am currently transmitting a formal document directly to your secure executive portal. Refresh your screen right now." A few seconds later, I heard the synchronized, high-pitched chiming of multiple expensive laptops receiving a new file attachment. I had just transmitted the official, legally binding invoice from Carter Compliance Solutions. "What exactly is this?" the chief executive officer asked, his voice trembling noticeably as his eyes scanned the digital document. $3.5 million. You are seriously demanding $3.5 million for a single technical service call. I am demanding $3.5 million to save your $480 million inventory from becoming very expensive, chemically inert, frozen garbage, I corrected him sharply, my voice cutting through the speakerphone like a scalpel. That is a flat, non-negotiable emergency service fee. I require an immediate, irrevocable wire transfer directly into my corporate holding account before I even put my coat back on. Furthermore, this specific contract strictly stipulates that I am granted absolute, unquestioned autonomy over the cold chain integrity grid during the entire extraction process. Nobody breathes on that server architecture without my express, documented permission. This is pure, unadulterated extortion. A random, panicked board member shouted wildly in the background. No, this is simply dynamic capitalism, I replied smoothly, throwing their own hollow buzzwords right back at them. You specifically wanted out-of-the-box solutions. Remember you aggressively demanded agile workflows. Well, this is the current, non-negotiable market rate for an independent biometric rescue operation. You have my terms. Take them or leave them. Suddenly, the frantic, high-pitched voice of the chief financial officer pierced through the chaotic boardroom chatter. Sir, the mainframe system timer just updated on my dashboard. We have exactly 15 minutes before the automated distress beacon transmits a red alert directly to the federal inspectors at the Food and Drug Administration. If that signal goes out, federal agents will lock this entire building down, and our stock price will plummet to absolute zero by the opening bell. We do not have time to debate this. We have to pay her right now. The phone line went dead quiet once again. The psychological tension was so incredibly thick it could choke a horse. They were entirely trapped in a shrinking, freezing vice of their own arrogant creation, helplessly watching the digital seconds tick away toward total corporate annihilation. They were bleeding out on the table, and I was the only person in the entire world holding a tourniquet. Do it, the chief executive officer finally whispered. His voice was completely hollowed out, entirely broken by the crushing weight of utter defeat. Authorize the massive wire transfer. Give her whatever she wants. Just save the inventory. Executing the wire transfer immediately, the chief financial officer replied, his voice shaking violently. I could hear the loud, frantic clicking of his mechanical keyboard. The massive funds are clearing the corporate bank account. The transfer is officially complete. I will see you shortly, I said, and calmly ended the call. I stepped through the automated glass doors of the Novartis Biologics main lobby, wearing a sharply tailored, charcoal gray trench coat. The security guards at the front desk, who had watched me surrender my badge and walk out in disgrace just a few hours prior, simply stared in stunned silence as I bypassed the visitor log entirely. Right as my leather boots hit the polished marble floor, my smartphone emitted a crisp, pleasant chime. I glanced down at the illuminated screen. The notification from my banking application confirmed that a wire transfer of $3.5 million had officially cleared and was sitting comfortably in my checking account. I locked the screen, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and walked toward the private executive elevators with the posture of a reigning queen returning to her conquered territory. When the elevator doors parted in the sub-basement, the atmosphere was thick with absolute desperation. The emergency red strobe lights were still aggressively painting the concrete walls in harsh crimson flashes. The heavy ambient air was painfully cold, a direct result of the cryogenic vault violently purging its heat through the thick titanium walls. Standing in a tight, shivering semicircle around the main biometric terminal were the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, and several highly anxious members of the board of directors. And then there was Julian. Despite having single-handedly engineered the greatest financial disaster in the history of the corporation, Julian was still desperately clinging to his fragile illusion of authority. His expensive $5,000 suit was wrinkled, his tie was violently loosened, and he was sweating profusely despite the freezing temperature. When he saw me approach the massive blast doors, he aggressively stepped forward, attempting to physically block my path to the terminal console. "All right, let us get this over with," Julian barked, pointing a shaking finger at the keyboard. "I am going to stand right here and closely monitor every single keystroke you enter. You are not going to inject any malicious backdoor codes into my supply chain network. Proceed with the biometric scan, and do not try anything clever." I did not even look at him. I simply turned my head toward the chief executive officer, raising a single, highly judgmental eyebrow. The executive immediately stepped forward, grabbed Julian firmly by the shoulder, and violently shoved him backward. "Shut your mouth and step away from the console, Julian," the chief executive officer hissed, his voice trembling with unrestrained rage. He then turned to me, offering a pathetic, forced smile. "Please, Reese, the digital timer is showing exactly 7 minutes remaining. We have met every single one of your financial demands. Please unlock the vault." I stepped up to the reinforced steel casing. I brushed a layer of fresh white frost off the retinal scanner lens. I positioned my right eye directly in front of the targeting laser and held my breath. The grid system acknowledged my physical presence. The targeting reticle aligned. The laser scanned the unique vascular structure of my retina. A loud, aggressive mechanical buzzer echoed through the freezing corridor. The terminal screen violently flashed red. "Access denied. Hostile entity detected within perimeter." The entire board of directors collectively gasped. The chief financial officer grabbed his own chest, looking like he was about to suffer a massive cardiac event right there on the concrete floor. "What happened?" the chief executive officer screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You said you could fix this. You took our money. Why did it reject you?" I stepped back from the console, maintaining absolute, unwavering composure. I looked at the panicked executives and offered a cold, razor-sharp smile. "The grid is functioning perfectly," I explained, my voice completely devoid of panic. "When your maintenance crew drove an industrial diamond drill into the structural housing of this terminal, the system initiated the intruder protocol. It actively scanned the immediate area for the source of the sabotage. The artificial intelligence logged the closest active employee identification badge to the physical breach. It recorded the digital signature of the man who gave the direct order." I slowly turned and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Julian, who instantly turned the color of wet ash. "The system currently recognizes your vice president of supply chain as an active, hostile biological threat," I declared smoothly. "The primary directive of the grid is absolute preservation. It will completely reject my primary retina scan, and it will keep these blast doors permanently sealed. As long as the recognized saboteur exists in your corporate database and remains standing within 100 feet of this vault." Julian opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at the blinking red screen in absolute horror. "What exactly are you saying?" "Reese," the chief executive officer demanded, looking frantically at the timer that had just ticked down to 5 minutes. "I am saying that I cannot save your $480 million inventory until Julian is permanently purged from the human resources database, stripped of all internal credentials, and physically removed from this building by your security team," I said, folding my arms across my trench coat. "And you have exactly 4 minutes and 50 seconds to make it happen." The chief executive officer did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. The corporate loyalty Julian thought he possessed evaporated instantly in the face of total financial ruin. The executive pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing the head of human resources on speed dial. "Terminate him," the chief executive officer barked into the phone. "I do not care about the paperwork. Delete Julian from the global directory right this second. Erase his profile entirely." He ended the call and snapped his fingers aggressively at the two massive, heavily armed security guards standing at the edge of the hallway. "Grab him. Drag him out the front doors. If he resists, throw him onto the pavement." The two guards immediately lunged forward. They grabbed Julian roughly by the arms, completely ignoring his pathetic, stammering protests. The man who had arrogantly fired me just hours ago in a glass box to optimize his workflow was now being violently hauled away like a common trespasser. His expensive Italian leather shoes dragged helplessly across the concrete floor. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with profound, crushing humiliation, but I simply offered him a polite, entirely merciless wave goodbye. 30 seconds later, the internal network synchronized. The system cleared the hostile threat registry. I stepped back up to the terminal. The timer was showing exactly 2 minutes remaining. I leaned forward and placed my eye against the cold glass of the scanner. The laser swept across my retina one final time. A soft, pleasant chime echoed from the console. The massive screen instantly shifted from emergency red to a calm, glowing green. Authorized quality. Keyholder recognized. Quarantine protocol disengaged. Deep inside the thick concrete walls, the massive magnetic deadbolts disengaged with a series of heavy, satisfying mechanical thuds. The pneumatic pumps roared to life, and the gigantic, 4-inch thick solid titanium blast doors slowly hissed open, releasing a massive cloud of freezing white vapor into the corridor. The blaring sirens immediately cut off, replaced by the gentle, steady hum of the standard refrigeration units returning to their normal operational capacity. The $480 million in experimental gene therapies were completely safe. The executives slumped against the walls, gasping for air, entirely drained of their arrogant corporate posturing. They looked at me not as an insubordinate employee, but as an untouchable force of nature. I pulled my coat tight against the chill, turned my back on the open vault, and walked calmly toward the elevator. I had walked into this building 6 years ago as an eager engineer. I was walking out today as a millionaire, holding absolute, uncontested power over the life and death of their entire corporate empire. And the best part was, they had paid me millions of dollars to teach them a lesson they would absolutely never forget. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Boss Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.